My name is Tom, and I've always been skeptical of the supernatural. Ghost stories never really fazed me, and I prided myself on being rational and level-headed. But one summer in 2015, my beliefs were put to the test when I encountered something that defied explanation. It all began when I inherited Ridgewood Manor from my late uncle. The manor was an old, stately home nestled in the countryside, surrounded by dense woods. My uncle had lived there alone for years, and the locals often spoke of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions. I dismissed these tales as superstitions, eager to explore my new property. I moved in during the early summer, excited to restore the manor to its former glory. The first few weeks were peaceful. The house, though old and creaky, had a certain charm that I found comforting. But as I settled in, I began to notice unsettling things. One night, as I was reading in the library, I heard faint footsteps echoing through the hallway. I paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped. I dismissed it as the house settling and went back to my book. But the footsteps continued, growing louder and more distinct. They seemed to come closer, then stop abruptly outside the library door. My heart pounded as I called out, "Who's there?" But there was no response, only silence. I opened the door and looked down the dimly lit hallway, but there was no one there. The air felt heavy and a chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to my reading. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors would open and close on their own, cold spots appeared throughout the house, and I often heard whispering voices late at night. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I saw a shadowy figure in the bathroom mirror. It stood behind me, its eyes hollow and dark. I spun around, but the room was empty. I decided to do some research on the history of Ridgewood Manor. What I found was chilling. The manor had a dark past, with stories of tragic deaths and unexplained disappearances. One tale stood out. A young woman named Eliza had lived there in the late 1800s. She was said to have been driven mad by grief after her fiancé died in a hunting accident. Eliza was found dead in the manor, and her spirit was rumored to haunt the house. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I reached out to a local historian, Mrs. Hawkins. She agreed to visit the manor and share what she knew. When she arrived, she was visibly uneasy, but she agreed to a tour of the house. As we walked through the manor, Mrs. Hawkins recounted the tragic history of Eliza and the strange occurrences that had plagued the house for decades. Suddenly, the air grew cold and we heard a soft, mournful wailing. The sound seemed to come from the old hall room. We made our way to the ballroom, and as we entered, the temperature dropped even further. In the center of the room, a misty figure began to take shape. It was Eliza, her eyes filled with sorrow and despair. She looked directly at us and whispered, "Help me." Mrs. Hawkins and I stood frozen in terror as Eliza's spirit moved closer. She reached out a hand and I felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through my body. Just as I thought I would lose consciousness, Eliza vanished and the room returned to normal. Shaken, Mrs. Hawkins explained that Eliza's spirit was trapped in the manor, unable to find peace. She suggested we hold a seance to help her move on. Desperate to end the haunting, I agreed. That night, we gathered in the library, lit candles, and held hands. Mrs. Hawkins called out to Eliza's spirit, asking her to find peace and move on. The air grew cold and the candles flickered, but there was no sign of Eliza. We continued for what felt like hours until finally the room filled with a warm, comforting light. The haunting stopped after that night. The manor felt lighter and the oppressive presence was gone. My name is Emily, and I've always been fascinated by the supernatural. But in the summer of 2016, my curiosity led me to an experience that shook me to my core. It began when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend at Silverwood Cabin, an old, remote cabin deep in the forests of Oregon. The cabin belonged to Sarah's family and had been in disuse for years. Locals whispered tales of strange occurrences, but we dismissed them as mere legends. We arrived at the cabin on a sunny Friday afternoon. The air was fresh and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature. The cabin itself was charming if a bit run down. We spent the day exploring the surroundings, laughing and enjoying each other's company. As night fell, we settled in for a cozy evening by the fireplace. The mood was light and we played games and shared stories. Around midnight, the atmosphere took a sudden, eerie turn. A cold breeze swept through the room, making the flames in the fireplace flicker. "Did anyone else feel that?" Tom asked, shivering. We nodded, feeling a sense of unease. Sarah tried to brush it off, suggesting it was just the draft from an old cabin. But the strange occurrences continued. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, and we heard faint whispers echoing through the rooms. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, we decided to call it a night. As I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The room felt cold and the whispers seemed to grow louder. Just as I was about to drift off, I saw her, the ghostly figure of a woman standing at the foot of my bed. She had long flowing hair and wore a tattered dress. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression was one of profound sorrow. I froze, unable to move or scream. The ghostly woman reached out a hand, and I felt an icy touch on my forehead. "Help me," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. The next morning, I told my friends about the apparition. Sarah's face went pale, and she shared a story her grandmother had told her. The cabin had once belonged to a young couple, Amelia and Robert, who had moved there to start a new life. Tragically, Robert died in a logging accident, and Amelia, overcome with grief, took her own life in the cabin. Her spirit was said to haunt the place, seeking solace for her broken heart. Determined to help Amelia find peace, we decided to hold a seance that night. We gathered around the fireplace, lit candles, and called out to Amelia's spirit. The air grew colder, and the room filled with a palpable sense of sorrow. Suddenly, the ghostly figure of Amelia appeared before us. "Amelia," I said gently, "we're here to help you. Find peace and move on." Her eyes filled with tears and she nodded slowly. The room was filled with a warm, comforting light, and Amelia's spirit began to fade. Before she vanished completely, she whispered, "Thank you." The cabin felt different after that night, lighter and more peaceful. The strange occurrences ceased, and we spent the rest of the weekend in tranquility. Whether it was a hallucination or a genuine encounter with the supernatural, I'll never know. But one thing is certain, the ghost of Silverwood Cabin will stay with me forever.